Well, hello everyone and welcome back. I apologize for being a ghost there for a bit, but as I was preparing for retirement, it was a lot more work than I had anticipated. And then I had, a long list of chores that I wanted to get done around the house. I have pretty much taken care of the list, so I think it's time to get back to making some videos and sharing some canning ideas and recipes. And so today I'm going to work on marinara sauce, and I hope that you'll come along for the ride. It's a pretty simple process, just a few steps involved. So I will be back in a moment with the tomatoes so we can get started. As you may have gathered from previous videos, I don't have a large garden on my plot of land here, so I have to look for sales at the grocery store and then make the best use that I can of the products that I find. Also, we live pretty close to an area here it's locally known as the Haugen, which is about a 4.5 or 5 hour drive away, where you could go seasonally, say maybe the first couple of weeks in September, and you can pick up things like the late peaches and tomatoes and all the different kinds of squashes and potatoes and things like that from the farmers that are actually growing them. So I found this deal on the vine tomatoes for $1 a pound, which where you live, that might seem like a lot, but where we live, that's a really good deal. So I took advantage of it. I have 12 pounds of tomatoes here that I'm going to use for this marinara recipe. And I am just gonna set about checking the tomatoes over and making sure that they're in good condition. I'm gonna make a little X on the bottom of them because I am going to remove the skins from them. And I'm going to pop them in the bowl while the water heats over here on the stove. So the on the vine ones all seem to have these little stickers on them. So I'll be removing them as I go along as well. I hope that everybody's staying well and getting feeling better about where the world is going at the moment as far as the COVID vaccine goes. I know that in some places it's still a big issue, but where we live right now, it's starting to feel like we're getting it under control as more and more people become vaccinated. So I will carry on with all of these tomatoes and just talk a little bit maybe about what it is that I've been up to. So I don't think I've shared on this channel before that I used to be the executive director of the museum in the community that I live in. And it was a position that I held for 30 years. So there was a lot of information for me to hand over to my successor, and we were really fortunate to be able to have worked the last year together, and that meant a great deal of training because she wasn't trained in the museum arts, and so for her to take on this position without any schooling was not going to be easy without some help. I'm happy to say she is doing really well at her schooling, and she's doing really well at the job. But it is hard to give up something that you've worked on for such a long time. It was like my baby, I guess, because I work there every day by myself. So I have lots of history of the area stuck in my brain, and I hope to be able to keep sharing that information with people, and that they will continue to seek me out for advice because I love to do it, but I also love to work on genealogy and family history for people, for other people other than myself. And I've done quite a bit of work for people trying to find family members. Maybe they were adopted and they're looking for information on their adoptions. So it's always a good feeling to be able to reunite families with loved ones that they haven't seen since birth, although not every outcome is a happy one. So as you can imagine, some people don't want to be found, but for the most part it's a very rewarding career that I've had, and I miss it right now. I'm only a month away from work, and I really miss it. So I've started to sit in front of my computer for a little while every day and just work on some family history for people that I've promised to do things for, and see if I can't get that taken care of. So why am I making the marks on the bottom of the tomatoes? Well, it's just to give them a relief point and a starting point for me, because I want to be able to peel them easily and I don't want them to burst. So if we just make a little mark, then we'll have a good start to getting the skins to slip. So there we go. There's 12 pounds of tomatoes. So now I'm going to go over and I'm going to dump them into some hot water, a few at a time, and then into my sink that I've filled with cold water so that I can stop the cooking process, and we'll get these tomatoes skins slipped off. So carry on, come along. Now this process doesn't take too long as a general rule. So you want to be watching so that you're not cooking these skins right on. This one's looking pretty close. So I'm actually going to pull that one out and into the cold water. Then you just repeat this process until you have all your tomatoes done. Now, as you can see, these tomatoes are the skins are easily slipped off these tomatoes at this point, because we've just left them for a little while in the cold water, and it has stopped the cooking process and it's allowed the skins to come away easily. So I will continue with the rest of these until I have them all done, and then I'll be back to show you the next step. So as you can see, I have all of the skins off, and now I'm going to move on to the next step. So these are fresh tomatoes off the vine. So they are going to contain water, and it will be too much for my sauce because I'd have to boil it down forever. So I'm going to take the tomatoes, I'm going to dice them up, and then I'm going to squeeze them to remove as much of the seeds and pulp as I possibly can. Maybe the best way to do this. So out comes the core. And I don't know about you, but I find with the vine tomatoes, they definitely have a bigger core. It's like, I don't know if it's got something to do with them being picked on the vine and they stick good, but it's definitely something to consider. And of course, watch your hands while you're doing this method. I normally do this on a cutting board, but I'm trying to show you how to do it here. Now see that entire part? whoops, sorry, that entire part came out as part of the core, which seems like a lot of waste. I am going to run these through a grinder after, so I will be removing a lot of the seeds and the cores at that time too. There isn't anything quite as good as having your own canned goods put away into your cupboard for any time. Where we live, most people can in the fall, for the fall season, like to keep you through the winter, because they're canning things that came out of their gardens. But I'm finding that more and more people are just canning when they can get their hands on the produce, which is, of course, the ideal time to do it, because if the protein, or if the product is at the top of its season, that's the time that it's going to have the most flavor and be the most useful. So I'm just going to carry on with this, and I will be back with you when I'm ready for the next step. Well, I'm now at that point where I have removed all the seeds and the core part from all the tomato pieces, and I'm surprised to find out that these tomatoes are pretty dry. So I am not going to just chop them and then add them to the pot to cook for a while. I'm going to actually give them a spin in my food processor, which should help me to break up the pieces. So I'm going to do as you would with it when you're doing it anytime. I'm just got my food processor all together, and I'm going to turn it on low, and I'm going to start feeding it through and then dumping it into the pot. Well, I know that you can't really see in the pot all that well, but that come out very well. It's I quit feeding it through the blade on the top after the first bunch, just so that I could get a bit of really fine stuff, and then I took that top blade out and just chopped it like maybe 4 or 5 seconds, just enough to chop it up pretty finely. And I've got it into my pot, and now the other ingredients go in. Now, the difference between marinara sauce and a regular spaghetti sauce really is that in the marinara sauce, you're making a sauce that's really the basis for a lot of other sauces. And the spaghetti sauce will often have things in it like meat or vegetables. This one does not have any vegetables other than the tomatoes. Oh, that's not entirely true, I guess, if you count the garlic and the dehydrated onions that are in here as well, and then the herbs that go into the dish as well. So next, into this pot, we're going to add a tablespoon of a dark balsamic vinegar. There we go. We're just building all kinds of flavors into this recipe. And we're going to add 1/4 cup of olive oil. And by the way, we're going to watch this for a couple hours on the stove today before we get into the canning process. And then here on this plate, let's see if I can remember everything that I've gotten on here. I have 2 tablespoons of kosher salt, and I used kosher because I'm out of sea salt, so that's up to you. I use kosher salt in most all my canning and cooking generally. I have 6 chopped cloves of garlic, 1½ teaspoons of rosemary, 1½ teaspoons of oregano, 1½ teaspoons of thyme, basil, 1½ teaspoons. Then I have 1 teaspoon of crushed fennel seed. I have 1/2 teaspoon of poultry seasoning, 1/2 teaspoon of black pepper, and 3 tablespoons of brown sugar. In the center here I have 2 bay leaves, and a half a cup of dehydrated onion. The dehydration process definitely is one that's interesting in how it builds flavor. So this won't taste like regular onion anymore. It's been elevated a little bit. So this is the kind of tricks we like to add to our food. So in go the bay leaves, and I'm just gonna move the rest of it into the pot. And we are going to get this busy on the stove. Now, this is definitely not one of those canning projects that you can do in, you know, half an hour. But I can certainly tell you that it's worth the time and the effort that you're going to put into it. It's a delicious recipe, and it's wonderful to have put away in your pantry for any time. As I kind of indicated earlier, I'm not trying to fill my pantry for a whole season. We just like the flavors of the food that we preserve ourselves. So anytime we can find a bargain on something, we can it or we freeze it, and we utilize every bit that we possibly can. So there you go. Now, I think you can see that very well, but we're going to put it onto the stove now. We're going to hustle it up to a boil, and then we're going to simmer and stir for the next couple hours. And I will be back to show you the canning process once this is ready. So just before we get into putting the sauce in the jars, we need to add a little bit of lemon juice. I'm going to add a tablespoon for every jar, because we don't know what the acidity level of these tomatoes are, and we want them to be shelf stable. So by adding some acid to the jar, we are ensuring that. So now within our 1-inch space, I'm going to use the skewer to ensure that everything is bubble free, because we don't need any bubbles in there giving us any grief, harboring bacteria or anything like that. We're going to wipe down the rim, add a new seal, add the ring, finger tight, and I'm just going to wipe the jar itself down. Now behind me, you may not be able to see it. Oh, you may be able to see it. I have my Nesco pressure canner back here, but I've removed its pressure canning lid, and I'm going to use it as a water bath. So I just use a regular pot lid on top of it, and it works like a charm. So I'll just add these to the counter as I go along. Whoops. I just got to be a little more cautious than that. I'm not sure how many jars I'm going to get out of this, and this is why I'm not doing a whole bunch of them with the lemon juice all at the same time. I feel like 5 maybe good jars, but just don't know. I wonder how many of you are using electric canners now, and do you love them? Because I certainly love mine, and even in the time that I have been away from YouTube, I've been using my canner because it's just so darn simple to be able to take leftover anything pretty much, and pop it into a jar and fill the canner. Even if you've just got a couple jars of food, you can run your canner. And when I say that, I mean if you've only got a couple of jars of food and you want to run them in your canner, remember that the canners are tested for their efficiency by being run with a full load in them. So it's really important that you do a full load. So even if you don't have a full load of food, fill some of your empty jars with water and put that into your canner. Even if it's got old seals and rings that you know aren't going to produce anything, this is totally worth it. Totally worth the time and effort that I've put in today to have this delicious marinara sauce put away in the cupboard for those days when you just don't know what's for dinner. And if you can go in there and open a few jars of ready-made something, at least these ready-mades, you know what's in the jar, which to us is important. And we don't have to worry about whether or not we can read all the ingredients. In fact, some of them are terrifying, frankly, to read what's in a jar of processed food that's intended for long-term storage. There we go. What do you think, folks? Do you think this is something that you would be able to easily do on a slow afternoon at home? I think it is. You don't need a lot of special equipment to do it. You could definitely use, my water bath canner is out in storage right now, so I haven't brought it in yet, but I will now, as the fruit and veggies are starting to come in season. And so all I did was remove the lid from my pressure canner, which you could totally leave the lid on and just carry on, but I prefer to do it this way. So it works just as well. And I was just trying to show you that you can really do it with any vessel, that you can cover the jars with water and keep them at a full rolling boil for the amount of time recommended. So because I'm at a high altitude, these jars are going to process in the water bath canner, they're pint jars, 40 minutes. If you were at a lower altitude, they would be 35 minutes, because we just have to add 5 minutes more for our altitude here at, I think we're around 2,500 feet. Well, folks, I hope that you've learned something here today, or at the very least, you've been somewhat entertained. This is my first video back in a long time, so that I know that I've got a lot of things out of sorts, but hopefully it'll just come back to me and I'll be able to carry on from where I left off before. In the meantime, I'd like to give a shout out to all the young women in my community who have recently, in the last year, taken up canning and preserving food for their homes and their families. And I am excited to share my knowledge with them as a knowledge keeper in our community, and I look forward to talking with you again soon. So take care, everybody, and I will be back soon.